Day 6, Old Testament in Genesis, about Abraham and Lot. And I absolutely love this story, and I think everyone in the world can relate to this story because I love how even in strife, Abraham did what was right by his family member. So what happened is Abraham and Lot both acquired great wealth, and there started to be strife within the family camp. So Abraham said, "Take everything you have and go around and search and find any land you want, and I will give it to you." Well, unfortunately, Lot chose the land in Sodom. And it says in Sodom that they were very wicked and everything they did it against God. They gave no reverence to any kind of a God. And they were, it says, extremely wicked. Well, if the Bible says somebody's extremely wicked, trust me, they're wicked. So what happened is when you surround yourself with evil, bad things happen. So all of a sudden war broke out everywhere, and they came in and captured everything that Lot owned. His family members, all of his possessions, his land, his livestock, everything was taken away from him. But what does Abraham do? As a good, godly man, is he gets 318 of his best trained warriors and sent them after them to recoup everything that the enemy had taken. And here's what I love. When you fight a battle for God and you're living your life right, it says in the Bible that Abraham's 318 trained men, and you know they were way, way under the number of warriors out there on the battlefields. And yet, God brought them victory. And it says that all of Lot's possessions were completely restored. They were all returned to Lot. And here's what I love too. Abraham said, "I will not keep any spoils. Give Lot what is his, and only what my warriors had eaten, that is all I will keep," because he said to the king of Sodom, "You will never be able to say that my wealth came from your spoils." There's something to be said for that. So Melchizedek, who was the king of Salem and also a high priest, came and blessed Abraham. And God told Abraham that your descendants will be like the stars in the sky, meaning completely countless. There'll be so many. And he blessed Abraham. And that was the first tithe ever talked about in the Bible. And a tithe is the first 10% of what you make, because God says the first 10% is mine. So Abraham took the first 10% of everything that he owned and gave it to Melchizedek and blessed him. Well, I have tithed all my life, and I'm telling you now, it works. God seems to expand everything else you have when you're willing to give God your best and your first fruits. And I would highly recommend, if you're not a tither, to consider that. And tithing is giving to your church and the places where you are fed spiritually. I'm telling you, it works. Day 6, New Testament. I hear a lot of people say in the Christian world, "Oh, we're saved by grace. We don't have to follow all the 10 commandments and all those things because Jesus forgives." We absolutely are saved by grace. And the definition of grace is unmerited favor. We can't deserve it. We can't earn it. Yet, Jesus still holds us to a very high accountability in how we're supposed to live our lives right before him. And I'm going to give you an example of this. One of the 10 Commandments says, do not commit adultery. So Jesus, as he's talking to his disciples, says committing adultery is even looking at a woman with lust. And that's a pretty tough one, right? And he said, if there's any part of your body that causes you to sin, it's better for you to cut that member of your body off than to spend an eternity in hell. So we certainly want to do what's right, and I can give you a great example of that. He also talks about divorce, and he says the reason for divorce is unfaithfulness. Well, unfaithfulness is obviously adultery, because in a marriage, the two are one in a covenant. And when you commit adultery, you break that covenant. And I believe that abuse, physical and extreme abuse, is also breaking that covenant, and it's being unfaithful. But here's what I love, is Jesus says to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And I went through a very difficult divorce after a 25-year marriage. And I tell everyone, had a fabulous marriage. He just happened to have a much better time than I did. So that covenant was broken. But I have the privilege of sitting on Joyce Meyer's board. And we were talking one day, and she said, have you forgiven your husband? And this is during the divorce proceedings 13 years ago. And I said, oh, of course I have. Of course I have. I forgave him. Absolutely. She said, have you ever said a bad word about him? Ruh-roh. She said, true forgiveness is never again saying a bad word about that person. That's a tough one, but guess what? She is right, and it's biblical, and God says, bless your enemies, love your enemies, and pray for those who persecute you. Day 6, and we are in the Psalms, 6, 1 through 10. A lot of the Psalms are either, it seems to me, extreme worship and gratefulness. And a lot of the Psalms were actually songs that were sung to the Lord in worship. And also, a lot of the Psalms is when people were totally downtrodden. For example, when David, was defeated in battles, which happened occasionally. And I always say we may lose some battles, but we're going to win the war in the end. So David lost some battles, and he failed, and he fell, and he had adultery with Bathsheba and all these things. But I love it because God says that David had a heart for him, and he called him his friend. That to me is the ultimate compliment, when God calls you his friend. I just think that's the coolest thing in the world. But this particular psalm that we're reading this morning is downtrodden. Rescue me. I'm worn out from sobbing and going on. And I love the truthfulness and the honesty in this, because we've all been there. When I went through my divorce, sometimes all I could do was just cry, help. I was so downtrodden, and I was so beaten down and so exhausted and so devastated. Yet God was always there for me, even in my worst times. And we all have those times. So then day 6 in the Proverbs, and it's Proverbs 1, 29 through 33, which says, people hated knowledge and chose not to fear God. And there's a lot of people in this world, and that's the beauty, is it's a choice. God gives us free will. We can choose whether we're going to live our lives right for him or if we're not. And that's kind of the beauty of this world, because otherwise we'd be robots or puppets on strings, and we'd be completely controlled. But instead, he loves us so much that he gave us a free will and a choice. but we certainly want to make a choice living for him, because it says, all who listen to me will live in peace, and they will be untroubled by fear or harm. That is a promise of God. So let's take it and run and take God at his word.